Napoleon's Grande Armée crossed into Russia in June of 1812 with 600,000 soldiers and one of the most effective military logistical systems the world had ever seen. Within 6 months, it was effectively gone. History remembers the winter, the frozen retreat, the bodies stacked at the Berezina crossing. That version of events came directly from Napoleon himself, written in an official bulletin while the disaster was still unfolding. He blamed the cold. But the men were dying in summer, in a heat wave, from something crawling through their uniforms before a single flake of snow had fallen. Why did the world accept Napoleon's explanation for so long? And what was the army actually dying of? In August of 2001, a construction crew in the Carriage suburb of Vilnius hit something that stopped the bulldozers cold. Bone. Then more bone. Then uniforms, or what was left of them, rotted to gray rags pressed flat by 2 centuries of Lithuanian soil. The workers had broken into a mass grave. Not a small one. Archaeologists were called in. Then forensic teams. Then, eventually, a laboratory in Marseille that would quietly dismantle one of the most accepted stories in military history. The pit held 3,200 skeletons, stacked and tumbled together without ceremony. Buttons were recovered from the burial layers, flat brass discs still stamped with regimental numbers. The numbers told the story before the science did. This was Napoleon Bonaparte's Grande Armée, or what the Russian campaign had left of it. These men had died in December of 1812 during the catastrophic retreat from Moscow in temperatures that dropped to -30. The world had known for 200 years what killed them. It was the winter. It had always been the winter. Except the Marseille laboratory found something else entirely. Scientists extracted DNA from the dental pulp of the skeletons, the teeth being the one part of the body that preserves genetic material long after everything else has collapsed into earth. What they found in that pulp was not frostbite. It was not starvation. It was Bartonella quintana, the bacterium that causes trench fever, and Rickettsia prowazekii, the pathogen behind epidemic typhus. Both are louse-borne diseases. Both spread in conditions of filth and overcrowding. Both destroy an army from the inside, quietly, before the killing ground is ever reached. Here is the thing that changed the question entirely. The men in that grave died in December, but the infection had begun in July when Napoleon's army crossed into Russia in the full heat of summer, 600,000 men packed into a column that stretched across the horizon. The lice were already in their clothes before the first snow fell. The winter did not break the Grande Armée. The winter finished what disease had already started. Consider the scale of what that means. Napoleon marched roughly 600,000 men into Russia in June of 1812. By December, when the survivors staggered back across the Niemen River, estimates put the losses at somewhere near 500,000. Dead, captured, deserted, or too sick to stand. The largest military force Europe had ever assembled, gone in 6 months. The question that Pitt and Vilnius forces open is not how Napoleon lost. It is when, and to what, and whether anyone around him knew the army was already dying before the first battle was ever fought. The answer to that question is worse than the winter. On December 16, 1812, a document landed in Paris that would shape how the world understood the disaster for the next 2 centuries. Napoleon called it the 29th Bulletin of the Grande Armée. He had dictated it himself in a carriage, racing west through Poland while the army he was supposed to be commanding froze and fragmented behind him. He had abandoned his troops at Smorgoni on December 5th, handed command to Murat, and climbed into a sledge. He reached Paris 11 days later. The bulletin arrived just ahead of him. The language was careful. precise in exactly the ways it needed to be. The army, it explained, had suffered from the rigors of the season. That was the phrase. Not the failures of supply, not the typhus burning through the ranks since July, not the decisions that put 600,000 men on a single road with no medical infrastructure and no contingency. The season. The cold, an act of nature that no commander could be court-martialed for. The bulletin closed by noting that the emperor's health had never been better. The reason the winter story survived is not that it was convincing. It survived because it was useful. Cold indicts no one. Cold is no one's fault. A general who loses his army to typhus spread by lice in July has questions to answer. A general whose men froze in a Russian winter in December is a tragic hero. The memoirs came next, and they hardened the legend. Philippe de Ségur published his account in 1824. Sergeant Bourgogn's were even more vivid, men stumbling through snow, frozen to their weapons. Both books are extraordinary, and both books, written by survivors who experienced the retreat in full, frame the cold as the executioner. They were telling their own truth, but it was a truth that began after most of the dying was already done. The story the bulletin invented was elegant enough to become permanent, and it buried the real timeline under 200 years of frost. What that means for the commanders who watched it happen is the part no memoir bothered to record. On June 24, 1812, 685,000 men crossed the Niemen River into Russia. It was the largest invasion force ever assembled in European history. French, Polish, Italian, German, Dutch, Spanish, over 20 languages in the column. They moved under flags from a dozen dissolved kingdoms and conquered provinces, all of them feeding into a single road heading east. Napoleon had built an army that won by moving. That was the system. Not supply depots, not wagon trains, not the slow logistics of the old European powers. His men foraged. They stripped the land ahead of them, fed themselves on what they found, and arrived at the battle faster than the enemy expected. In Italy in 1796, it worked brilliantly. At Ulm in 1805, he encircled an entire Austrian army before it could react. At Austerlitz 2 months later, he destroyed the combined forces of Austria and Russia in a single afternoon. Speed was the weapon. Hunger was the price of speed, and the men paid it. For Russia, he made one concession to scale. He assembled a supply train of nearly 20,000 wagons. It was the largest logistical effort of the Napoleonic Wars. It was also already falling behind before the army reached its first objective. The roads east of the Niemen were sand. Deep, soft, wheel-swallowing sand. Horses that had marched through Poland began dying within the first week. Wagons sank to their axles. The column stretched and fractured. Men who were supposed to be receiving rations were instead eating their horses, then eating nothing. The land offered no solution. Western Europe had density, farms close together, granaries that foraging parties could strip and move on. Eastern Poland and the Western Russian borderlands had almost none of that. Villages were sparse, yields were low, and whatever was available vanished the moment the vanguard passed through. The troops behind them found empty cellars and burned fields. Within days of crossing, the system that had conquered half of Europe had already collapsed. Men were dispersing off the road looking for food. Bivouacs were overcrowded, water sources were fouled, and discipline was softening at the edges. The army had not yet seen a single Russian soldier. And it was already dying. What was killing it would take months to name. 3 pontoon bridges across the Niemen at Kovno, That was how the greatest army in the world entered Russia, not through a gap torn in enemy lines, not through a conquered fortress. Across 3 rope and timber bridges, columns 4 men wide, shuffling forward in the dark before dawn on June 24, 1812. It took 4 days for the army to cross. 4 days of that unbroken column inching east while Napoleon watched from the far bank, counting. Somewhere in those numbers was the first sign of what was coming. The crossing itself killed men. Heat, crowding, the weight of full kit in the July sun. Soldiers fell from the bridges. Some drowned. Nobody recorded how many. What waited on the other side was worse. A ferocious heat wave had settled over Lithuania. Temperatures climbed to levels that turned the march into something close to a death walk. Men dropped in formation. Then, days later, the heat wave broke with a violent cold rainstorm that swept the plains for hours. Horses, already weakened, died by the thousands. Not in battle. Not from Russian guns. From the cold and the wet and the exhaustion of a march that had barely started. Dysentery spread through the columns within the first week. Then fever. The causes were predictable to anyone who looked. Fouled water sources, overcrowded bivouacs, no sanitation, men eating whatever they could find. The hospitals at Vilnius, 60 miles inside Russian territory, were overflowing within 2 weeks of the crossing. Surgeons reported cases in numbers that made no sense for an army that had not yet fought. Napoleon reached Vilnius on June 28th, 4 days after the crossing. He expected to find a staging point for the next push. What he found was an army already hemorrhaging. Stragglers were filing into the city in thousands. Men had abandoned their regiments, their weapons, sometimes their boots. Some had simply walked into the countryside and not come back. By mid-July, before any major engagement with Russian forces, the Grande Armée had lost somewhere between 50,000 and 80,000 men. Dead, sick, deserted, or simply gone. The Russians had not done this. The road had. The weather had. The system had. And Moscow was still 600 miles away. The body louse is 3 millimeters long, smaller than a match head. It cannot jump. It cannot fly. It moves from person to person only through direct contact or through shared clothing. In the summer of 1812, the Grande Armée handed it an entire continent's worth of bodies. Pediculus humanus corporis lives in the seams of clothing, not on the skin. It crawls down to feed, piercing the skin to drink blood, then retreats back into the fabric to lay its eggs. The bite itself is not the problem. The scratch is. When a soldier raked his fingernails across the welt, he pushed the louse's feces into the broken skin. And in those feces lived 2 of the most dangerous organisms in the world. The first was Rickettsia prowazekii, epidemic typhus. It incubates for 2 weeks, which meant a man could march 100 miles before he felt anything. Then came the headache, the fever spiking above 104 degrees, the rash spreading from the torso outward. Then delirium. Soldiers who survived described days of hallucination so complete they could not distinguish the road from their own dreams. Mortality in field conditions ran as high as 30%. There was no treatment. There was no cure. You either lived or you didn't. The second disease was Bartonella quintana, trench fever. It did not kill as reliably, but in some ways it was worse for an army. A 5-day fever, relapsing again and again, too sick to march, too alive to leave behind quickly. It drained regiments of men who were not dead but were completely useless. The invisible arithmetic of the campaign ran on soldiers like these, men removed from the column one by one, left in whatever village the army had just passed through. The Grande Armée was a perfect incubator. The men did not change their uniforms. They had no soap, no access to baths, no reason to undress in the freezing nights. They slept pressed against each other for warmth, louse passing to louse across the seams. The more they suffered, the closer they huddled. The closer they huddled, the faster it spread. By the time the army approached Smolensk, the disease was not following the column. It was living inside it. And the worst march was still ahead. Napoleon's muster rolls from mid-August 1812 do not lie. 286,000 men had crossed the Niemen River in late June. By the time the army reached Smolensk, roughly 160,000 remained. The Russians had not done that. Borodino had not happened yet. The army was simply dissolving. Vitebsk and Smolensk became the accounting ledgers for the disaster. Both cities were converted into vast improvised hospitals, churches and warehouses packed with men too sick to walk. The orderlies assigned to them began dying too. There was no separating the caregivers from the sick, no clean line between the man treating typhus and the man catching it. Commanders wrote to Paris asking for medical supplies. Paris sent acknowledgments. The numbers kept moving in one direction. Borodino arrived on September 7th, the bloodiest single day of the entire campaign, 70,000 casualties between both sides in roughly 12 hours. Cannon smoke so thick that officers lost sight of their own units. Napoleon threw the Imperial Guard into the line and hesitated, and the Russians pulled back intact. It was the kind of battle that defines wars in history books. In the actual arithmetic of 1812, its toll was almost a footnote. Disease had already consumed more men than Borodino would ever claim, and it had done so quietly without glory, without witnesses. 14 days later, on September 14th, the Grande Armée entered Moscow. The force that crossed the Niemen had been nearly 600,000 strong across all columns. The men who walked through the gates of Moscow numbered fewer than 100,000. Napoleon had won every engagement on the road. He had taken the enemy's capital. By any traditional measure, the campaign was over. But there was no Russian delegation waiting. No surrender. Just an empty city and then, within hours, fire. The burning of Moscow did not lose Napoleon the campaign. That had already happened in the summer heat, in the louse-infested seams of 100,000 uniforms, in the hospitals of Vitebsk where men died faster than they could be recorded. The fire only stripped away the last reason to stay. Now Napoleon faced the question he had never planned to answer. How do you get what remains of an army back out? Napoleon left Moscow on October 19, 1812, with roughly 95,000 combat effectives and a column of wagons carrying looted silver, paintings, and furniture no one would ever deliver. He marched south, hoping for an untouched road and winter quarters. At Maloyaroslavets on October 24th, Kutuzov's army blocked the way. The French took the town, lost it, took it again, and held smoking rubble by nightfall. Napoleon looked at what was ahead and turned the army around. That decision sent them back onto the Smolensk road, the same road they had already stripped bare coming east. There was nothing left on it. No fodder, no grain, no shelter that hadn't already burned. The men who stepped onto it in late October were not the men who had marched east in June. They had spent months fighting fever on short rations, sleeping in their lice-infested clothes, burning whatever reserve the body keeps for emergencies. The cold, when it arrived, found nothing to work with. Temperatures dropped below -20 Celsius in early November. Men who were already weakened by typhus, dysentery, and starvation simply stopped. The cold gets the credit in almost every popular account. The hospital records tell a different story. Fever, not frostbite, dominates the casualty registers. Exhaustion and hunger appear again and again in the notes of the few surgeons still functioning. The cold was the final condition, not the cause. It finished men the disease had already hollowed out. The Berezina River crossing, November 26th through 29th, concentrated everything into 4 days. 2 bridges, a river partially frozen and partially not, and somewhere between 40 and 50,000 non-combatants and stragglers crowding the banks behind the army. When the French engineers destroyed the bridges on the 29th to stop the Russian advance, thousands were still on the eastern bank. They were left there. The survivors who made it across pushed into every barn and farmhouse they could find, stripping the dead for coats and boots, crowding together for warmth in spaces that turned every shelter into an incubator. Typhus moved through those crowds faster than it had moved through any summer billet. The men still walking west were not the lucky ones. They were simply the ones who hadn't died yet. And for many of them, the worst was still waiting. On December 8th, 1812, the first of what remained of the Grande Armée staggered into Vilnius. The city had hospitals. They could hold a few thousand patients. Tens of thousands were coming. The men who entered Vilnius were not retreating soldiers in any military sense. They were starving, frostbitten, fever-ridden wrecks who had walked hundreds of miles on the understanding that Vilnius meant food, warmth, and medicine. The city's supply depots were real. The care capacity was not. Within 48 hours, every hospital was full. Then every monastery. Then the Basilian convent on the edge of the city, packed with the infected until the corridors were impassable. Men who could not find a floor to lie on died in doorways. They died on the cobblestones outside the gates. The city that was supposed to save the army became its largest killing ground. On December 10th, Russian forces arrived. They found a city overwhelmed with the dead and the dying and a typhus epidemic burning through every building that had sheltered the French. The solution to the dead was grimly practical. Unused defensive trenches outside the city walls were already dug. The corpses were stripped of anything useful and thrown in. Thousands of men layered into the earth with no record and no ceremony. That was not the end of it. The epidemic did not stop at the city limits. It spread west through Lithuanian towns, into Poland, into German states, carried by the survivors still moving and by the populations who had contact with them. Civilians died for years. The pathogen the army had carried east from Central Europe, amplified by months of catastrophe, came back and kept killing long after Napoleon had left for Paris. Of roughly 500,000 men who had crossed east into Russia in June of 1812, perhaps 30,000 came out fit to fight. The trenches outside Vilnius stayed sealed for nearly 2 centuries. What archaeologists found when they finally opened them told the final piece of the story. In 2006, a team led by Didier Rault at the Université de la Méditerranée published results that closed the case for good. The evidence came from the trenches. Archaeologists had recovered the skeletal remains of more than 2,000 soldiers. Rault's team pulled dental pulp from dozens of those skeletons and ran PCR amplification, the same molecular technique used to detect pathogens in living patients, on material that had been sealed in the earth since 1812. They built in contamination controls. They ran the tests again. The results held. Roughly 1 in 3 sampled soldiers carried detectable DNA from Bartonella quintana, the bacterium that causes trench fever, and from Rickettsia prowazekii, the bacterium that causes epidemic typhus. Both are louse-borne. Both require a human body louse to spread. And from the clothing remains found in the same trench, the team recovered something else: the physical fragments of Pediculus humanus, the body louse itself, preserved in the soil alongside the men it had destroyed. This was no longer theory. It was the same army, the same trench, the same bacteria, the same vector, confirmed together by evidence that could not be revised after the fact. Compare that with what Napoleon reported. His official dispatches blamed the Russian winter, the scorched earth, the distances. He was not entirely wrong about any of those things. But the killing had begun in Poland in midsummer, before the cold arrived. His own medical officers had recorded the fever wards filling in June and July of 1812. Those reports were filed, noted, and eclipsed by the version that blamed the enemy and the weather, because that version blamed nobody in the chain of command. The legacy of that concealment ran forward for a century. Military planners who did not absorb the real lesson of 1812 sent armies into the Crimea, into the Franco-Prussian War, into the opening campaigns of 1914, carrying the same conditions that had destroyed the Grande Armée. Crowded men, unwashed clothing, lice. Typhus followed every one of them. It was not until the First World War, when deluzzing stations became standard infrastructure and the causal chain was finally understood in full, that armies began to systematically control the insect that had always been doing the killing. That insect was smaller than a grain of rice. The Grande Armée, the largest military force ever assembled in European history to that point, 600,000 men at its peak in 1812, was not broken by Russian generals or Russian winter. It was broken by a louse in a seam. The version we remember blamed Napoleon's ambition, the Russian cold, the impossible distances. That version had the advantage of being dramatic. It also had the advantage of pointing nowhere useful, implicating no system, demanding no reform. The teeth remembered something different. The teeth, 200 years later, told the truth.